So this is a Kvasir's Revenge review, a Kvasir's review in defense of the 2017 film Justice League. Now, I should preface this review by stating that I should disclose, I grew up mostly reading Marvel comics. I read DC. There were a number of DC comics that I read growing up, and a number of them made an impact on me. One big memory I have is when I read that big crossover. You know, crossovers are in film, in television, and in comics a common occurrence now. They weren't so common when I was a lad, and a crossover was a bigger deal than it is now. And there was a big crossover in the 80s, Crisis on Earth Prime. And anybody who remembers that probably remembers it was a big deal for its day. I think it was a well-written story, and so that was huge for me. I still remember reading that. But nonetheless, overall, I read Marvel more often. I felt closer connection to Marvel, a lot of Marvel heroes, like Spider-Man, Power Man, Iron Fist, some of the X-Men, The Thing, and some others. I felt a really connection to these characters and their struggles. So although I grew up preferring Marvel, I also feel that DC films, the recent Justice League in particular, are not receiving a fair shake from at least some of the professional critics. So what I intend to propose in this review is that the 2017 Justice League film is a good film, and it is a better film than that for which the critics give it credit. Notice I didn't end that sentence with a preposition. So let's look at this. Justice League has a score for professional critics of 41% on Rotten Tomatoes. Now, that's a score significantly lower than that of, for example, Thor: The Dark World, whose score is 66%. Pretty big difference. Now, the Thor film, the second Thor film, Thor: The Dark World, is often ridiculed as one of the worst Marvel films. Yet, Thor: The Dark World was a reasonably engaging film. Another film I defend. It's fun, and it probably deserved that score. That 66% score is probably reasonable for the movie. I use this example merely to point out that the professional critical response to Justice League has been overall more negative than necessary. Audiences seem to get it right, as reflected on the Rotten Tomatoes audience score, in which the aforementioned Thor film and Justice League have a nearly identical score. They have a 77 and 78% scores, respectively. So the film is not perfect by any means, Justice League. It's not a masterpiece, but it is a fun superhero film with a number of virtues and strengths. So I'm going to look at some of the criticisms that I don't completely accept, and then I'm going to look at some of the strengths of the film. One of the criticisms of the film, which is reasonable but incomplete, is that the film felt rushed or hurried. When you watch the film, it seems like a rushed product. And now, of course, we know it wasn't a rushed product. It took a long time to make the thing. And the problem, I think a lot of people probably recognize that any problems that exist in the film occur with reworks and re-edits and those sorts of things. But ultimately, that the stories and the segues from one scene to the next made the film feel like some stuff was missing. And probably when we see the Zack Snyder version, if that ever comes out, we'll see stuff that was missing, and maybe folks won't feel that way about that version. But the thing is that so often superhero films have, like, for instance, Batman v Superman. In a lot of science fiction and fantasy films, one of the shortcomings of those films is that a lot of stuff can be crammed in there without a full explanation, without the audience really understanding, or reasonably being able to understand what it was about or what it meant, and a bunch of stuff ends up sandwiched together. I've seen films, for instance, Batman, The Dark Knight. Great film. Should have been 2 films, in my opinion. Maybe I'll have to do a review and explain that position. But great film. That film, great film, should have been 2 films. This movie, Justice League, was, instead of rushed or hurried, to put it in a positive light, we might say that it was lean and that it was succinct. It said what it had to say, and it got the hell out of there. So maybe more films should be like that in that respect. Another criticism is the lack of characterization. You know, Often these fantasy films and adventure films and action films don't have a lot of character development. They're more about the action and the spectacle, and this is no exception. So that's a criticism of not only the film, but of the genre and of a number of genres. But I think there was some valuable characterization in this film. Maybe there should have been more of it. And a friend of mine that I saw the film with actually said that she wished there was more characterization in this film rather than less. But the film actually differed from another film that I enjoyed that has been discussed a lot when talking about Marvel versus DC, and the Thor Ragnarok, the third Thor film, didn't have enough characterization in it. Enjoyable film. I liked the film. But there were moments I wish the film would slow down and have the characters speak as actual people to one another. That film didn't do this. Justice League actually did this. For instance, after their disagreement, after they resurrected Superman, and Diana comes in and is talking to Bruce Wayne, Batman, and one of the lines in the film I really like is she pops his shoulder back into place and she says, you can't do this forever. And he replies, I can barely do it now. Which he's recognizing his mortality, especially in relation to her apparent immortality. So the plot's been criticized, but the plot is that there's an evil menace that's threatening life on Earth, and we have to defeat it, which is the plot of countless films of this nature. So yes, that plot has been, that Save the World plot has been done again, redone, overdone, reheated, resurrected more times than Superman. It's a standard science fiction, fantasy, and superhero film cliche. I'll use that word. However, to criticize Justice League for this and not criticize a multitude of other films in the genre will be inconsistent, to say the least. I think we can deal with that plot done and redone depending on how it's done, right? So another criticism of the film is the weak villain. Now, the villain Steppenwolf, he's physically powerful enough to challenge everyone except Superman. When Superman comes back, that's one of the reasons why we need Supes. That's been often a criticism of Marvel films as well. That's the thing about the superhero genre, and a lot of some fans will agree with that criticism, but they still enjoy the film, many of them. And there are other fans who don't care, and that's the thing, is that for many of these films, the villain is just something for the protagonists, the superheroes, are the characters we like to overcome. And they may have to come up with inventive ways to overcome the villain. They may have to show courage. They may have to tap into strengths they didn't know they have. And so the villain's there only to reveal the hero. So in many cases, I don't think the villain's that important. There is one quote from Steppenwolf that I like, though, when he's being defeated, and he says, "This world is my right." So I like that sort of sociopathic entitlement that the character had. That's probably not unusual among those characters as well, but he did not see himself as a bad guy. He made numerous quotes throughout the film saying that, "Why are you opposing this? You will love me." Wasn't a very good invitation, but so he wasn't psychologically that interesting, but there were things there that I could identify and appreciate about the way the character was conceived. So I don't think that weakness is particularly important, the so-called weak villain. So let's look at the strengths of the film and see what really, for a lot of viewers, and in particular for me, made this film work pretty well. The film had a number of strengths that not all superhero films have or have a lot of. So one is that the fight scenes, I think, were underappreciated. I've seen a lot of action films of all kinds, science fiction, martial arts films, superhero films. Sometimes the fights, often, I guess by definition, quite often they're going to be average or mediocre. That would be most of them if we use the bell curve. But this film, when Steppenwolf was fighting Wonder Woman and Aquaman, and they were each taking some serious hits, taking damage. One was stepping up when the other got knocked down. These kinds of things, I thought that was very well done. I thought Superman's physical confrontation with the League when he was first resurrected was well done. One or two minor criticisms I would have. One would be that Aquaman, when Superman threw everybody off of him, Aquaman was just gone for a while there when he could have been helping Wonder Woman. So that's a minor concern. But the confrontation itself, I thought, was well handled. So the fight scenes, I thought, were well choreographed and did a good job of reflecting each character's sort of strengths and weaknesses. Which brings me to the next strength I think the film had, and that the power levels were pretty consistent, and they were pretty well defined as to what each character could do, how they differed, how they compared and contrasted. This is not always the case. One of the reasons I stopped reading comics was the inconsistency. You know, you have all these characters, you have writers coming and going, you have different ideas for stories, that you have editors coming and going, you have different ideas that are evaluated by this group of people that keeps changing. So the abilities in the power levels of characters are wildly inconsistent. That's one of the things about comics that I occasionally read something, but not that often. And that's one of the big reasons. What it does is it brings me out of the story. It ruins my suspension of disbelief. So I'm taken out of the story. I can't enjoy the story anymore the way I would be able to if those things were consistent. And in fact, the way Superman faced off against Wonder Woman, I thought was very well handled. When he headbutted her, which he did pretty much right off, which I thought was quite rude. I don't know if that's a common Kryptonian failing or not, but he starts fighting an opponent and immediately goes to the headbutt. But Wonder Woman took it and headbutted him back, and it was this moment where he was stunned, and it was like, whoa. I thought that was really well handled. It was clear that Superman was the most physically powerful of all the characters, and they didn't make any. There was no doubt about that. The way everything, all the action scenes were handled, and Superman's super speed. I thought a great scene in the film during that confrontation that I mentioned already was when the Flash, who's accustomed to people not being able to perceive him when he's moving at super speed. I don't know what he thought he was going to do, but he starts running near Superman to try to help out the other members of the League. And whatever he thought he was going to accomplish, that idea clearly left immediately because he realizes that Superman can perceive him. And that scene was both funny and frightening at the same time. It was an interesting combination. Because it is frightening. You can see the fear on Flash's face, and it would be a frightening thing if you can put yourself in that position of that character who's accustomed to moving super fast, accustomed to people not being able to perceive him, up against this physically incredibly powerful being who seems to be going all Pet Cemetery on your friends, and you try to stop him, and you realize that he can perceive you even when you're at super speed, and maybe put his hands on you. So very frightening, and yet the way it was filmed was also funny. So that was very effective. It was terrific. So something about the film that a lot of people seem to be appreciating is the chemistry among the lead characters. Now, so yeah, this chemistry and this characterization and the performances by the actors and actresses, and one actress in particular, have been praised in the film, and I'm glad these are getting proper appreciation. So let's talk first. We could talk last, but let's talk first about Gal Gadot. Her characterization of Wonder Woman. I have heard critics say that although some critics have praised her performance, but I've heard some folks say that Wonder Woman wasn't well used in this film. I think she was wonderfully portrayed in this film, not only as characterized by Gal Gadot, but also the character proved herself not only to be very capable and powerful and brave, but also to have the ability to, and it's interesting, I don't know how on purpose this was, but one of the things that Bruce Wayne, Batman, pointed out to Wonder Woman in the film was that she had the ability to bring out the best in everyone. And then they questioned, why isn't she a shining beacon? And they had their conflict that revolved around, the resurrection of Superman, but also various elements of the other person's life and character. and resulted in that moment where Wonder Woman kind of pushed Batman and lost her temper a little bit, or was on the verge of losing her temper, which would be kind of frightening if you're Bruce Wayne, Batman, in that situation. If she lost her temper, she controlled herself. There was a moment, but Batman was right that Wonder Woman brings out the best in others, and she did that in this film in a way I'm not sure everyone noticed, but she was able to connect with all of the characters, show appreciation for them, keep them on task, and get them moving in the right direction. So she did that. She was able, for instance, to connect with Superman because they're both champions. They're both probably the two most powerful beings on planet Earth, so they were able to connect as these great, very powerful, practically godlike warriors of truth and justice, right? So they both connected on that sense. She connected somewhat similarly with Jason Momoa's Aquaman in that Aquaman's another prime warrior of his people, and she was able to connect with him on that way. In fact, although they unsuccessfully tried to restrain Superman, she he responded to her commands, right? At that point, she says, we have to restrain this guy, and he followed her orders there. They all followed her orders when she decided to take command during the last act of the film, as they're initially assaulting Steppenwolf's lair. She connected with Ezra Miller's The Flash. It wasn't as significant, the connection, but she was able to connect with him kind of as a caretaker, I guess, in a motherly role with him. With Cyborg, she connected with him in terms of life experience and loss, and was able to discuss loss with him, able to discuss with him how he can conceptualize it and make it meaningful to help him move forward. So she connected with him as, in that way, as a sort of mentor. And although she conflicted with Batman early on, or I guess maybe that was midway through the film, although she had a serious, actually shoved him, conflict with Batman, she also connected with him. And in that conversation that I mentioned earlier, where they sort of made up a little bit and they talked about the challenge that lay ahead of them. And I think she connected with him in the way that she recognized that he was willing to make a sacrifice, because he was willing to sacrifice his life to bring Superman back to save the world. And I think at that point she recognized that it wasn't merely out of guilt or only out of guilt, but out of a sense of obligation and out of a sense of courage. So in each of these cases, she connected with the other people that were just now forming this team for the first time and teaching them how to bring out the best of themselves so that they could stay together, work together, and get the job done. So I think she was this absolute, Wonder Woman was the absolute center point of this story in that respect. I think the characters that were struggling the most in this film were Batman and Cyborg. Now, Cyborg was portrayed by Ray Fisher. And the thing is Fisher's covered in a lot of CGI armor. I guess they'll play with the look of the character as they go on, because the Cyborg armor and its own AI sort of update and upgrade as time goes on. But Fisher had a significant challenge, and he really met it in his vocal performance. That was an amazing vocal performance by that actor. He really controlled his voice almost in the way expertly as an opera singer might control his or her voice in the performance of an opera, hitting all the right notes, hitting all the right tones. He portrays the character with a subdued pain, and subdued for a number of reasons, but partly because the character is so cerebral, is so thoughtful. And that's lucky for him, because that's what's keeping him sane, is his cerebral cortex, is his ability to think and consider, even though he's under a great deal of emotional pain, even though he doesn't deal with it perfectly well throughout, at least for the beginning of the film. He certainly deals with a lot of trauma, better than most people would, and it's partly because the character is so thoughtful, and there's an understated emotional power in that character that is perfectly brought forth by Ray Fisher's vocal performance. So from the more complex character of Cyborg to the simplest character, Jason Momoa's Aquaman. Aquaman is a big, fun-loving, barbaric brawler, right? Momoa is more suited, or he gave a better performance in this role, maybe better suited for this role than he was for Conan. I have a different idea of how Conan should be portrayed compared to how Momoa portrayed him in the Conan film they did a few years ago. I hope they find someone else to play Conan and they can relaunch that character. But, he has sort of a joy-filled spirit, this character, and he likes fighting. So he's this big, joy-filled brawler who's also, and it's funny because he's joy-filled in that respect, but he presents with a good deal of aggressiveness and sort of an anger and a darkness, and there are reasons for that, I think. So maybe the character, there's an underlying complexity there, I guess, that wasn't portrayed in the film. It was only hinted at, and maybe we'll get more of that if his solo film is well written. I think they could make, if they're worried about making these solo films like a solo Aquaman film, maybe they could make an Aquaman Wonder Woman buddy film. That would be interesting because they work so well together. So Ezra Miller's The Flash, some of the criticisms there are that sometimes the humor with The Flash worked, sometimes it didn't. Some of his quips were not funny. That's okay. My thing with The Flash and Ezra Miller's depiction of The Flash is that, he's a character who is uncomfortable around people, who is awkward and has a lot of nervous energy, and he's going to say a lot of stuff, and some of it's going to be funny and some of it's not going to be funny. So that worked for the character as far as I'm concerned. Didn't bother me at all when he did something that wasn't funny. I just thought, that's his character. That's who this guy is. And I like that they contrasted his character. In so many films, the superpowered beings are, just because they have superpowers apparently, they're very brave. And even when fighting and facing dangers that could destroy them, for some reason, everybody's brave. And The Flash, Ezra Miller's The Flash, Barry struggled with that. He was afraid. And he said, you guys are used to fighting. You're warriors. You're used to going into battle. I'm not. Mostly what I do is run really fast and push people, and which was a funny line. And you've seen the film, By the way, this is a spoiler review. I'll make sure I put that in the description. But if you've seen the film, Batman encourages him and says, just set a goal, which is a very good psychological approach by the Batman. Set a reasonable and realistic and simple goal and see where you go from there. So he says, save one person, then you'll know what you need to do next. And if he'd saved one person, that would have been it. But he discovered he could save that person. He built some confidence by saving one person. The more people he saved, the more confidence he built. And then he felt a need to assist his friends who were in battle. So I thought that worked really well. And finally, Ben Affleck's Batman. One of the criticisms I hear of Ben Affleck's Batman is that he wasn't Batman enough. If you remember the animated series, and there have been numerous, but in the Justice League animated series, well, primarily in that, I know that, and in some of the films, the animated films, Batman has been portrayed as playing not just three-dimensional chess, but like string theory chess. He's 11 dimensions of chess. And it's fun, and I enjoy that, but it can get pretty unrealistic. And it was interesting to me to see Batman vulnerable in this film. He still acquitted himself well. He was still effective. But he is a person without superpowers in a world with people with superpowers, some of them extreme superpowers, Earth destroyers, world destroyers. And how do you deal with that as a normal, regular, mortal human being? And I think that you got some of that in this film, that's the Batman that you got. And I think that it fits because in the Batman v Superman film, he was steps ahead, and he had a lot of things he thought figured out. And turned out he was wrong, right, to try to kill Superman. And he's learned something from that, and he's a more exposed, vulnerable person because he had to step back and question his morality and his own psychology. And he's seeking redemption. And when we're seeking redemption, we're vulnerable. And so we saw a Batman seeking redemption who's vulnerable and on multiple levels. So I thought that all worked together nicely. Whether the writers thought through that deeply or not, I don't know. But that's what I thought about when I watched the film. The way I experience it, the way I watch films, I experience a level of depth that maybe wasn't obvious. I think it's there. I think it's actually there. I don't think it's all only in my mind. And I think it has a lot of value for these reasons. In that respect, the movie is a lot like a number of the animated films, which a lot of the DC animated films have gotten good reviews, have been praised. And I thought this was more like a DC animated film than any of the previous DC live-action movies. And, of course, let's face it, a lot of live-action films like these today are also animated because they're full of CGI. But we do have live-action actors actually embodying the characters physically as much as possible. But it did play like one of those DC animated films. So I thought it worked, and I thought this was a strength. So in conclusion, Justice League did the things that a superhero movie must do. It entertained a significant portion of its target audience with what I believe to be well-designed action. It's possible that one of the reasons that it struggled with critics and with some audience members is that the film, I believe, was largely made for the fans of the characters, or with the fans of these characters in mind. So that's to say that the film makes some effort to appreciate and showcase important elements of each character, as I've been at some labor to illustrate in this review. So I think it's possible that this aspect of the film did not speak to non-fans. So what I say is, good film, underrated by professional critics. This movie could still be the beginning of whatever world DC decides to build. So this movie got the band together. Let's hear what tune they play next. I hope it rocks. Thanks.